So, Daniel chapter 10, verses 4 through 9. On the 24th day of the first month, as I was standing on the bank of the great river, that is the Tigris, so that's that river that runs through Babylon, Daniel's talking, I lifted up my eyes and looked, and behold, a man clothed in linen with a belt of fine gold from Uphaz around his waist. His body was like beryl. That's another word you can use to translate that as chrysolite. And I talked about this a few weeks ago. That's what sapphires and emeralds come from. So that's a very beautiful, beautiful gemstone. His face like the appearance of lightning, his eyes like flaming torches, his arms and legs like the gleam of burnished or polished bronze, and the sound of his words like the sound of a multitude. And I, Daniel, alone saw the vision, for the men who were with me did not see the vision, but a great trembling fell upon them, and they fled to hide themselves. So I was left alone and saw this great vision, and no strength was left in me. My radiant appearance, I still laugh when I read that expression, my radiant appearance was fearfully changed, and I retained no strength. Then I heard the sound of his words, and as I heard the sound of his words, I fell on my face in deep sleep with my face to the ground. So last week, since I was sick, Jerry ministered here, and I appreciate that. But if you were here 2 weeks ago, you might remember that this is the text that I taught from. However, this is my mea culpa here, my confession. I reached a significant conclusion, and I shared it with you, that I now believe was very wrong. And so I wanted to go through it again. This is the same text. I'm going to go through it again, and I'm going to try to get it right this time. And I could have, maybe covered it up and pretended, but it bothered me. And you'll see why as we go through this. And I'm going to reteach this text and show you where I went wrong. I think I went wrong. And I think now I've got it right, and it's important that I do this. But before I explain that where I got it wrong, I need to go back and look at the context, the setting of this passage, where going all the way back to verse 1, Daniel is introducing this vision that he had seen, and specifically, he was describing what it did to him. So let's go back to verse 1 and read through verse 3. In the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a word was revealed to Daniel, who was named Belteshazzar. And the word was true, and it was a great conflict. And we're not going to read it. We'll get to it in a week or two. But if you go to, I think it's verse 14, it's a conflict that involves the Jewish people. So it's about his people. And he, Daniel, understood the word and had understanding of the vision. In those days, I, Daniel, was mourning for 3 weeks. I ate no delicacies, no meat or wine entered my mouth, nor did I anoint myself at all for the full 3 weeks. Now, there's a couple things we need to notice here. First of all, he sees there's going to be a great conflict. And again, if you read verse 14, it affects the Jewish people. And because he realized that this conflict would be so intense, so great, essentially for 3 weeks, he mourned, he fasted, because he's seeking God. And that's something we've seen Daniel do before in some of our other studies. Whenever he was faced with a crisis, typically in response to something God showed him about what was to come, Daniel would always seek the Lord in prayer. But what's interesting here is that, or one of the things that's interesting, is that the chronology or the order of events is reversed. So Daniel doesn't begin by saying what he saw in the vision. First, he describes how it affected him. That's verses 1 through 3. I saw this thing, it was terrible, I couldn't eat, I was mourning, And then afterward, beginning at verse 4, he describes what he had actually seen to make him react that way. So let me read it again. Verses 4 through 6. On the 24th day of the first month, as I was standing on the bank of the great river, that is the Tigris, I lifted up my eyes and looked, and behold, a man clothed in linen with a belt of fine gold from Uphaz around his waist. His body was like beryl, his face like the appearance of lightning, his eyes like flaming torches, his arms and legs like the gleam of burnished bronze, and the sound of his words like the sound of a multitude. So obviously, this was not just an ordinary human being Daniel was seeing. He was seeing some sort of a heavenly being, and he gives us really a very detailed description. He says this person he saw was dressed in linen, which is a very fine and beautiful fabric, typically reserved for wealthy people, or in the case of Jews, reserved for the priesthood. They would wear linen. He had a belt of gold, fine gold, around his waist. His body was similar to a gemstone in appearance, and the only thing that you can kind of come up with, it's almost like saying it was gleaming, his body, or sparkling might even be a word you could use. That's the use of a gemstone here, that image. It says his face shone like lightning, his eyes were like flaming torches, and his arms and legs were like polished bronze. And then Daniel says his voice was like the sound of a multitude, essentially saying whenever this person talked, it was like the roar of a crowd, like it was one person but many voices coming out, all saying the same thing, but not like listening to you or to me. Very, very unusual. And so 2 weeks ago, I told you that I thought this was a pre-incarnation manifestation of Jesus. What does that mean? Pre-incarnation, the incarnation is when Jesus came to earth as a baby. He was incarnate, born here. And so I said I believe this was a pre-incarnation manifestation of Jesus. And the reason I said that, well, number one, I read some scholars that I respected who said that. But I also did some of my own study, and I saw some parallels, some similarities between this heavenly being here in Daniel chapter 10 and some other manifestations of Jesus that occurred in visions in specifically Ezekiel chapter 1. We kind of went through that. And Revelation chapter 1, we went through some of that as well. However, and this is where I've got to say I got it wrong, I believe. I should have kept reading. You hear me talk about context a lot, right? That's my word. Well, the context is the setting of a passage, both the passages that come before and after a set of verses, also the history and the cultural situation. And my mistake, I was reading everything that led up to this vision in Daniel 10, this part of it. But the context of a passage not only includes the verses that come before it, just as important sometimes, it also includes the verses that come after it. And that was my mistake. There's something later that comes in the passage that I knew about, but I didn't take time to stop and read it. I just knew about it from previous study, but I didn't take time to stop and read it and think about it and consider the implications. And I want to show it to you. It has to do with what this heavenly messenger said to Daniel in verses 12 and 13. Then he said to me, "Fear not, Daniel, for from the first day that you set your heart to understand and humbled yourself before your God." Now, what does that mean? It's talking about the time when he was mourning and fasting, right? All the way back beginning in verses 4 through 6. Or verses 1 through 3. From that time, your words have been heard, and I have come because of your words. In other words, God's heard your prayers, and now I'm here. Now watch verse 13. The prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me. Now, I looked up that word withstood, or to withstand in Hebrew. It means essentially to raise up against someone or to stand against them. So if I see you trying to get somewhere and I want to get myself between you and your goal, you'd use this Hebrew word. I would stand up against you. I would try to withstand you. That's what this word means. The prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days. But Michael, now we've already met Michael, he's an archangel. One of the chief princes came to help me, for I was left there with the kings of Persia. So, again, remember what I said 2 weeks ago about my initial impressions of this heavenly figure. I was looking at Ezekiel 1. I was looking at Revelation 1, and those are visions of Jesus very clearly. And so I saw similarities, I saw parallels, and so I made the case that this being, this heavenly being here in Daniel 10, is probably also Jesus. However, just Monday when I started studying again for this tonight, and I was reading ahead and I got to verse 13, that's when I realized there's no way that what I said could be right. Absolutely no way. Because it says that it calls him the prince of the kingdom of Persia. That's an evil spirit. Why do we know that? Because it resisted this heavenly being, this messenger from God, who is coming to Daniel with the message from God. This king, prince of the kingdom of Persia, rises up against this angelic messenger and tries to prevent him from reaching Daniel. And for 21 days, he's able to succeed. And this heavenly being that's trying to reach Daniel needs help from the archangel Michael to overcome this resistance. Let's read it again, verse 13. The prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days, but Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, for I was left there with the kings of Persia. Now, when you think about it, that means this could not have been Jesus. Because an evil spirit, a demonic spirit, could resist an angel. An evil spirit could resist some other lesser being. But there's no evil spirit, not even Satan himself, who could hinder Jesus from doing anything he wanted to do. There was one time in Jesus' existence where Jesus emptied himself. Philippians 2:5 talks about this. Emptied himself temporarily of some of his freedom to use the power that came with being the Son of God. But that was temporary, and that was only during Jesus' earthly life. But this was well before that. And there is no, again, I'm repeating myself, but this is important, no evil spirit, no demonic spirit could ever stand up against Jesus for 21 days, let alone 21 minutes, and hinder him from doing anything. And that means Daniel 10, the first part, could not have been about Jesus. It could not. Jesus, it was and is and always will be God. And there's no comparison between God and anything else. And so this could not have been about Jesus. It must have been some sort of lesser being that was coming with a message from God to Daniel and was hindered by this territorial spirit, I'll call it, that had a certain degree of authority over Persia. So that then, what about all those parallels I showed you? Remembered I talked about especially Ezekiel 1, but also Revelation 1 to a degree. And I said, well, this heavenly figure parallels these visions of Jesus. And I got stuck there yesterday. But that's good for me to have that happen now and then, because it makes me really dig in and work hard. And I came across another possibility that I think really satisfied some of my questions. And it's in the vision of heaven that Ezekiel saw. In chapter 1 of his book, there's another group of heavenly beings that have features like this being in Daniel chapter 10. And I'm speaking of the living creatures. Some people call them cherubim, angelic beings, whatever. Living creatures is a pretty accurate translation of the Hebrew. Ezekiel sees them in the presence of God in this vision. Let's see what the Bible says here in Ezekiel 1 to introduce them. Ezekiel 1 verse 1. In the 30th year, in the 4th month, on the 5th day of the month, as I was among the exiles by the Kibar channel. Now that's also in Babylon. The heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God. Now let's go to verse 4. As I looked, behold, a stormy wind came out of the north, and a great cloud with brightness around it, and a fire flashing forth continually. And in the midst of the fire, as it were gleaming metal, and from the midst of it came the likeness of 4 living creatures. Okay? Now, here's how I'm going to give you a list of parallels between these living creatures, which are not Jesus, because there's 4 of them, and the heavenly being in Daniel 10. Like the heavenly being in Daniel 10, these creatures also had a human-like appearance. That's in verse 5. From the midst of it came the likeness of 4 living creatures, and this was their appearance. They had a human likeness. So that's parallel 1. Parallel 2, like the heavenly being in Daniel 10, they also had the appearance of flaming torches. Verse 13, the first part. As for the likeness of the living creatures, their appearance was like burning coals of fire, like the appearance of torches moving to and fro among the living creatures, and the fire was bright. And then third parallel, like the heavenly being in Daniel 10, their limbs also gleamed like polished bronze. That's in verse 7. Their legs were straight, and the soles of their feet were like the soles of a calf's foot, and they sparkled like burnished or polished, same word, same meaning, bronze. Then fourth parallel, like the heavenly being in Daniel 10, they also moved about like flashes of lightning, verse 14 of Ezekiel 1, and the living creatures darted to and fro like the appearance of a flash of lightning. Now, what about the voice? That'd be the fifth parallel. These voices the voices of these creatures in Ezekiel 1, you don't hear anything about it, but they have wings that produce a sound very similar to the voice of the Daniel 10 being. It's in verse 24. And when they went, I heard the sound of their wings like the sound of many waters, like the sound of the Almighty, a sound of tumult, like the sound of an army. In other words, a multitude. And then finally, sixth parallel, Daniel 10, there you have the image of beryl, or chrysolite, the precious gemstone, and you also have it here in Ezekiel 1, verse 16. It's not the creatures, but it's the chariot of God's presence around them. As for the appearance of the wheels and their construction, their appearance was like the gleaming of beryl. So the parallels aren't perfect, but they're there. So here's the point I'm going to make, and then almost done, and then you can tell me why you need a better pastor in this church. We have our discussion time. The point I want to make is this. Daniel saw a heavenly being in chapter 10, in this vision, who shared a lot of the attributes that these heavenly beings in Ezekiel 1 had. And if those beings in Ezekiel 1 were angels or cherubim, whatever word you want to use, heavenly beings, then I think you could make a case that the same is true, very likely, of this being in Daniel 10. This was not Jesus. I was wrong, I believe. And when I'm wrong, it's incumbent upon me to get in front of you and tell you. If it was some minor thing, no, maybe not. We all make small mistakes, but this is a major thing. And I didn't get it right. I'm pretty sure of that. And so I had to tell you that. So I believe this was an angel. And that brings me to something I've been saying throughout the series. I've been saying, and maybe it's just kind of a way to get out of trouble, but I've said, I'm going to get some things wrong. And boy, did I. There are things about Daniel that I still don't understand, even things we've studied. And I've tried to be careful and tell you that at some points I was speculating because I really didn't know things I got wrong. And so for you, here's your responsibility. Don't take everything I say as gospel. You are responsible to examine these things for yourself. You have a Bible. You can read, right? And so you need to do that. And it's not just a good idea for you to confirm what I say. It's a biblical idea. Let me leave you with a famous set of verses from Acts 17, verses 10 and 11. The brothers immediately sent Paul and Silas away by Berea, and when they arrived there, they went into the Jewish synagogue. Now these Jews were more noble than those in Thessalonica. They received the word with all eagerness, so they listened. But what else did they do? They examined the scriptures daily to see if these things were so. So I'm apologizing to you guys. I didn't do enough work. I did a lot of work, but I didn't do enough work. And I messed up. I think I've got it right this time. And from this point, I pledge to work harder and do a better job. I still may get it wrong. And if I do, I'll tell you if I find out. But anyway, thank you for listening and for being patient. But if you got to let me have it, now's the time. All right? Discussion.